The tray slipped from Nell's hands the moment the scream echoed down the servant's stairwell, and porcelain shattered across the stone floor like breaking ice. She did not stop to look at the mess. She ran toward the sound, her apron catching against a nail on the doorframe, tearing loose as she pushed into the narrow corridor that connected the kitchen to the grand house above. Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, stood frozen at the bottom of the back stairs, one hand pressed to her chest. "It is Lord Ashcombe," she whispered. "Something has happened at the stable. Go, girl, fetch water and cloth quickly before the master's guests hear the commotion." Nell did not ask questions. She grabbed a clean linen from the shelf and ran again, her bare feet slapping against cold flagstones, her heart pounding harder than it had in months. She had worked in this house for 3 years, scrubbing pots and hauling coal, and never once had she seen the great hall in chaos. Tonight of all nights, with the ballroom already filling with candlelight and music for the Duke's grand gathering, disaster had chosen to strike. Outside near the stable yard, a small crowd of grooms and footmen had gathered around a fallen horse, and a young man pinned beneath its weight. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Rowan, lay on the cold ground, his coat torn at the shoulder, his face pale from pain, though he was trying with visible effort not to let it show in front of his household. "Get the horse up," someone shouted. "Careful now, careful." Nell pushed through the gathering without thinking, kneeling beside the Duke before anyone could stop her. She pressed the cloth against a gash on his arm where a hoof had caught him as he fell. Her hands moved quickly, steady despite the shaking in her chest. "Hold still, my lord," she said. "The bleeding will stop faster if you keep the arm raised." He looked at her then, startled, as if noticing for the first time that a kitchen girl was giving him instructions in front of his own servants. His eyes were sharp, gray like winter sky, and even in pain, they studied her face with a kind of curiosity that unsettled her. "You speak with confidence for someone holding a rag," he said, his voice tight but edged with dry humor. "My mother tended wounds before she tended kitchens, my lord," Nell answered, not looking up. "I learned enough to know that panic helps no one." The head groom finally freed the horse and lifted it away, and 2 footmen moved to help the Duke to his feet. But he waved them off for a moment, still watching Nell as she wrapped the linen tightly around his arm. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nell, my lord, Nell Winthrop." The surname slipped out before she could stop it, a name she rarely spoke aloud, a name that belonged to a life she had buried the day her family lost everything. She hoped he would not notice, would not ask further, and to her relief, he did not. His attention was elsewhere, on the pain shooting up his arm, on the guests waiting inside who must not learn that their host had been thrown from his own horse only an hour before his ball began. "Thank you, Nell Winthrop," he said finally, letting the footmen guide him toward the house. "You may have saved me from bleeding onto my own dance floor. That would have given the gossips something far more interesting to discuss than my choice of orchestra." A few of the servants laughed nervously, relieved that their master could still joke despite the accident. Nell rose from the ground, wiping her hands on what remained of her apron, and watched him disappear through the side door, already composing himself, already becoming the calm and distant Duke that society expected to see that evening. She should have returned to the kitchen immediately. There was still the broken tray to clean, the soup to finish, the endless list of tasks that came before every grand occasion in this house. But she lingered a moment at the edge of the stable yard, staring at the lit windows of the ballroom glowing gold against the darkening sky, listening to the first notes of music drifting faintly through the glass. For one breath, she let herself imagine what it might feel like to walk through those doors as a guest instead of a servant, to wear silk instead of wool, to be greeted with a bow instead of a command. Then she shook the thought away, the way she always did, and hurried back inside before Mrs. Whitfield noticed her absence. The kitchen was a storm of noise and heat when she returned. Pots clattered, orders were shouted, and the cook, a broad woman named Agnes, was red in the face from the effort of preparing food for over 100 guests. Nell swept up the broken porcelain first, then returned to her station at the long wooden table, chopping herbs for the final course with quick, practiced motions. "You look pale," said Ruth, another maid working beside her, a girl close to Nell's own age who had become something like a friend over the years. "What happened out there?" we heard shouting. "The Duke fell from his horse," Nell said quietly. "He is hurt but not badly. I helped bind the wound." Ruth's eyes widened. "You touched the Duke with your own hands." "I bandaged his arm, Ruth. I did not dance with him," Nell said, allowing herself a small smile despite the tension still coiled in her chest. "Still," Ruth whispered, leaning closer, "they say he has grown cold since his father passed. Distant. He barely speaks to anyone unless it concerns business or duty. My aunt works in the linen room upstairs, and she says he has refused 3 proposals of marriage already this year, each one arranged by his own aunt, Lady Prudence, who is determined to see him settled before the season ends." Nell said nothing, focusing instead on the herbs beneath her knife. She had heard the rumors, too, whispered among the staff during quiet hours, about the young Duke who had inherited his title far too early, burdened with responsibilities he had never asked for, surrounded by relatives eager to shape his future to suit their own interests. It was not her place to think about such things. Dukes did not concern themselves with kitchen girls beyond a moment of gratitude after an accident, and kitchen girls did not dwell on Dukes beyond the retelling of an exciting story to pass the evening. And yet, as she worked, she found herself remembering the way he had looked at her, not with the usual polite indifference of the wealthy toward the poor, but with something closer to genuine attention, as though she were a person worth noticing rather than a pair of useful hands. She pushed the thought away and focused on her work. There was a locket hidden beneath her collar, cool against her skin, a small oval of tarnished gold that had once belonged to her mother. She touched it now, and then without thinking, a habit formed over years of hiding who she used to be. Inside it, a tiny painted crest remained, faded but still visible if one looked closely enough, the mark of a family name that no longer meant anything in the world she now lived in. Her father, Earl Winthrop, had lost his title and his fortune when she was only 12 years old, brought down by debts he never fully explained and enemies he never named. Her mother had died soon after, worn down by shame and hardship, and Nell had been sent to live with distant relations who saw her only as an extra mouth to feed. By 16, she had found her own way into service, choosing the anonymity of a kitchen over the pity of relatives who reminded her daily of everything she had lost. She had built a quiet life since then, one built on hard work and invisibility, and she had convinced herself, mostly, that she no longer missed the world she had been born into. Mostly. The evening wore on, the sounds of laughter and music growing louder above the kitchen ceiling as the ball reached its peak. Nell carried trays up the back stairs more than once, catching glimpses through the narrow service door of glittering gowns and polished shoes, of chandeliers throwing golden light across a floor so smooth it looked like glass. She never lingered long enough to be seen, slipping in and out with practiced efficiency, but each glimpse stirred something in her chest she tried hard to ignore. On her final trip up, carrying a tray of refreshments to the side hall, she paused near the ballroom entrance, drawn by a familiar voice. It was the Duke, standing near the doorway with his arm now properly bandaged beneath his sleeve, speaking with a group of gentlemen who laughed loudly at something one of them had said. His posture was stiff, his smile polite but distant, the same mask Ruth had described, worn like armor against a room full of people who wanted something from him. For a brief moment his eyes lifted and found hers across the crowded hall. Something flickered there, recognition, perhaps, or simple curiosity, before one of his companions spoke again and pulled his attention away. Nell looked down quickly, continuing on her path, telling herself it meant nothing at all. But as she made her way back down to the kitchen, the noise of the ball fading behind her, she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her earlier that evening in the stable yard, nor about the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in her chest since that moment, small and stubborn, refusing to be dismissed. Whatever tonight had begun, she told herself firmly, it would end here. She was a kitchen girl and he was a duke, and the distance between them was wider than any ballroom floor. And yet, as she reached the bottom of the stairs and the noise of the party grew faint above her, She could not quite convince herself that the distance felt as certain as it once had. Back in the kitchen, Agnes was calling for more bread to be sliced, and Ruth was already elbow-deep in dishwater, humming a tune that drifted up through the open windows from the orchestra above. Nell took her place at the table again, grateful for the familiar rhythm of work, the way it kept her hands busy and her mind, for a little while, quiet. "You are somewhere else tonight," Ruth said, glancing at her sideways as she scrubbed a silver bowl. "Your knife has been resting on that same piece of bread for a full minute." Nell blinked and looked down, realizing it was true. "I am only tired," she said, though the excuse felt thin even to her own ears. "Tired or thinking about a certain gentleman with a bandaged arm," Ruth teased, a knowing smile tugging at her mouth. "Do not be foolish," Nell said, though her cheeks warmed despite herself. "A duke does not think twice about a servant who happened to be standing nearby when he fell from his horse." "Perhaps not," Ruth said, turning back to her dishes. "But you have not stopped touching that locket of yours since you came back inside. You only do that when something has unsettled you." Nell's hand froze halfway to her collar and she forced it back down to the table, picking up her knife once more. Ruth did not press further, and for that small mercy Nell was grateful. There were parts of her past she had shared with no one in this house, not even the girl who had become closest to a friend, and she intended to keep it that way. A locket was only a locket, she reminded herself. It meant nothing to anyone but her, and it would stay that way long after tonight's ball had ended and been forgotten. Outside, the music swelled toward its final movements, and somewhere above the kitchen ceiling, in a world of candlelight and silk, the Duke of Rowan moved through his own party like a man, performing a role he had grown tired of playing, unaware that the girl who had bound his wound only hours earlier would return to his thoughts long after the last carriage rolled away from his door. 3 days after the ball, Lady Prudence Ashcombe arrived at the house unannounced, her carriage rattling up the drive with the force of a woman who did not believe in wasted time. She swept through the front doors before the footman could finish opening them, calling for her nephew in a voice that echoed through the marble entrance hall. "Julian, where is that boy hiding himself?" Julian was in his study, his injured arm resting on the desk as he reviewed correspondence from his estate manager, and he did not need to guess why his aunt had come. She had been threatening this visit for a week, ever since her last attempt to introduce him to a suitable young lady had ended in polite but firm refusal. "Aunt Prudence," he said, rising as she entered, "you might have sent word ahead." "I did send word," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. "You simply chose not to read it, as you choose to ignore most things that concern your future. I have come to discuss the ball, and more specifically, your conduct at it." "My conduct was perfectly proper," he said. "I greeted every guest, danced with several ladies your friends were eager to present, and managed to do so despite falling from my own horse an hour beforehand." "Yes, I heard about that unfortunate incident," Lady Prudence said, waving a gloved hand as though the accident were a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine injury. "What concerns me is not your arm, Julian, but your heart, which seems determined to remain as empty as it has been since your father passed. You are 27. You hold one of the finest titles in the county, and yet you treat every eligible young woman brought before you as though she were a business proposal to be politely declined." Julian set down his pen, weary of an argument he had endured too many times to count. "Perhaps because that is precisely how they are presented to me. I am shown ledgers of family connections and dowries before I am shown a single conversation worth having. Forgive me if I find the arrangement lacking in warmth." "Warmth," Lady Prudence repeated, her tone sharpening. "You speak of warmth as though it were something a duke could afford to wait for indefinitely. Your cousin Cedric has already begun suggesting, quite loudly at his club, that you may never marry at all, and that the title might eventually pass to him should you continue in this manner. I would not give that man the satisfaction, Julian, not after everything your father worked to build." The mention of Cedric Vane, his cousin and longtime rival, was enough to still Julian's protests, if only for a moment. Cedric had always resented standing second in line to a title he believed himself better suited to hold, and he had spent years cultivating alliances among the very social circles Julian found so exhausting, waiting patiently for any sign of weakness he might exploit. "Cedric can suggest whatever pleases him," Julian said finally. "I will not be rushed into a marriage, simply to spite a man who cares more for my title than for me." Lady Prudence studied her nephew for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, though her voice retained its edge. "I do not ask you to marry for spite. I ask you to marry for sense, before circumstances force a choice upon you that you like even less than the ones I have offered. There is a gathering at the Farrington estate next month, a smaller affair, more intimate than the ball. I have already accepted on your behalf. You will attend, and you will make an effort, Julian, or I shall begin to believe the rumors that something is genuinely wrong with you." She left as abruptly as she had arrived, and Julian sat alone in his study for a long while afterward, staring at the stack of letters on his desk without truly seeing them. His aunt was not wrong to worry, he knew. The estate required an heir eventually, and society expected nothing less from a man of his position. But every young woman he had met in the past year had approached him with the same practiced smile, the same careful conversation designed to please rather than to reveal anything true about herself, and he found the sameness of it all suffocating. He thought, unbidden, of the kitchen girl in the stable yard, the steadiness in her hands as she bound his wound, the quiet confidence in her voice as she told him to hold still. She had not smiled at him the way the young ladies at his balls smiled, careful and calculated. She had simply done what needed doing, unconcerned with impressing him, and something about that honesty had lodged itself in his memory more firmly than he cared to admit. He shook his head at the thought, irritated with himself. It was absurd to compare a servant girl to the daughters of earls and viscounts his aunt paraded before him. And yet, over the following days, he found himself glancing toward the kitchen stairs more often than he could explain, listening for a particular voice among the household staff, though he told himself each time that he was merely curious about the girl's recovery from the stressful evening, nothing more. Meanwhile, below stairs, life continued its usual rhythm, though Nell noticed a subtle change in how the other servants treated her. Word had spread quickly about her role in bandaging the Duke's arm, and while most of the staff found the story amusing, a few looked at her with something closer to suspicion, as though her brief moment of usefulness to their master had somehow elevated her above her station in ways they did not entirely trust. "You should be careful," Agnes warned her one afternoon, kneading dough with more force than the bread strictly required. "Servants who catch a master's eye rarely end up better for it. Either they are dismissed for imagined impropriety, or worse, they are kept too close and ruined for it. Best to remain invisible, girl. Invisible servants keep their positions the longest." Nell nodded and said nothing, though the warning settled uncomfortably in her chest. She had not sought the Duke's attention, had not done anything beyond her duty in that stable yard, and yet she understood Agnes's concern well enough. In a household built on strict hierarchies, even the appearance of familiarity between master and servant could bring trouble neither of them had asked for. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination after that conversation, taking care to avoid the upper floors whenever possible, sending Ruth or one of the younger maids in her place for tasks that might have brought her into the Duke's path. It was easier, she told herself, to simply avoid the possibility altogether than to risk becoming the subject of gossip that could cost her the only stable life she had built for herself since her family's ruin. But avoidance proved more difficult than she expected. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the ball, she was sent to the library to collect a stack of correspondence that needed sorting, a task usually given to the head housekeeper, but delegated to Nell that night due to Mrs. Whitfield's sudden illness. She entered quietly, expecting the room to be empty at that late hour, only to find Julian seated near the fireplace, a book open on his lap that he did not appear to be reading. "I did not expect anyone to be here, my lord," she said quickly, dropping into a proper curtsy. "I can return for the letters another time." "There is no need," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. The letters are on the desk by the window. Please take what you came for. She moved toward the desk, aware of his eyes following her across the room, and gathered the papers as quickly as her hands would allow, hoping to leave before conversation became unavoidable. "How is your recovery, my lord?" she asked, more out of formal politeness than genuine curiosity, though she found herself wanting to know the answer regardless. "Nearly complete, thanks to your quick thinking," he said. "I have been meaning to properly thank you, Nell Winthrop, though it seems the household keeps you too busy for me to find the opportunity." "There is nothing to thank me for, my lord. Any of the staff would have done the same." "I doubt that," he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "Most of my staff would have fainted at the sight of blood or fetched a physician and stood wringing their hands until he arrived. You simply acted. That is rarer than you might think, even among people of far greater rank than a kitchen maid." Nell felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, unsure how to respond to praise so directly given, and she busied herself with straightening the stack of letters in her arms rather than meet his gaze. "My mother taught me that panic serves no purpose in a crisis, my lord. I was simply following her example." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Julian said, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Is she still living?" "No, my lord. She passed some years ago." "I am sorry to hear it," he said, and something in his tone suggested he genuinely meant it, rather than offering the hollow condolence she had grown accustomed to hearing from those who considered themselves her betters. "It is a hard thing, losing a parent too soon. I understand something of that myself." She glanced up at him then, surprised by the honesty in his voice. And for a moment, the distance between Duke and servant seemed to shrink, if only slightly, replaced by the shared understanding of two people who had each known loss far earlier than they should have. "I am sorry for your loss as well, my lord," she said quietly. "Thank you," he replied, and the silence that followed felt strangely comfortable rather than awkward, until the clock on the mantel chimed the hour and reminded them both of the world waiting beyond this quiet room. "I should return these letters before Mrs. Whitfield wonders what has become of me," Nell said, curtsying again before turning toward the door. "Nell," Julian said, and she paused, glancing back at him. "Thank you again, truly." "You are welcome, my lord," she said, and left the library with her heart beating faster than the short walk should have warranted, telling herself firmly that a few kind words from a duke meant nothing at all, even as some quiet part of her refused entirely to believe it. Over the following weeks, such encounters repeated themselves more often than either of them likely intended. Brief exchanges in hallways, a shared glance across a crowded room during a smaller gathering the Duke hosted for his estate managers, a conversation about books that lasted longer than propriety strictly allowed, when Nell was sent to dust the library shelves and found Julian already there, absorbed in reading. Neither spoke of these moments to anyone else in the house, and neither acknowledged, even to themselves, how much they had begun to anticipate them. Ruth noticed, of course, as Ruth noticed most things, but she kept her observations to herself for once, sensing that whatever was growing between her friend and their master was too fragile, too dangerous, to be spoken aloud within walls that had ears in every corner. Agnes noticed too, and her warnings grew more frequent, more pointed, though Nell found herself, despite every instinct for self-preservation, unable to fully heed them. Lady Prudence, meanwhile, continued her campaign to see her nephew properly settled, arranging the promised gathering at the Farrington estate with meticulous care, unaware that the young man she hoped to match with a suitable bride had already begun, quietly and against his own better judgment, to think of someone entirely unsuitable far more often than he thought of anyone his aunt had chosen for him. Cedric Vane visited the house twice during those weeks, ostensibly to discuss matters of family business, though his true purpose seemed to be gathering information he might later put to use. He was a lean, watchful man with a talent for noticing details others overlooked, and on his second visit, he lingered near the library door long enough to see Julian and Nell emerge from a conversation that had clearly run longer than any errand required. "Your servants seem remarkably devoted to your comfort, cousin," Cedric remarked afterward, settling into a chair in the drawing room with the ease of a man who considered every corner of the estate partly his own. That particular girl in the plain gray dress, was she not the one who bandaged your arm at the ball? I am surprised you remember her name well enough to seek her out for conversation. I did not seek her out, Julian said, keeping his tone carefully even. She was collecting letters for the housekeeper, and courtesy demanded I not ignore her presence entirely. Of course, Cedric said, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth that suggested he believed nothing of the sort. Courtesy. It is admirable, truly, how thoroughly you attend to the well-being of your household staff. Aunt Prudence will be pleased to hear how well you have taken her advice to heart, though I suspect she meant something rather different when she urged you toward warmer company. Julian said nothing, unwilling to give his cousin the satisfaction of a reaction, though he felt a flicker of unease settle in his chest long after Cedric had departed. His cousin was not a man who forgot useful information, and Julian understood, with a certainty that troubled him more than he liked to admit, that whatever quiet friendship had begun to form between himself and Nell Winthrop would not remain unnoticed for long, not with eyes as sharp and ambitions as patient as Cedric's watching from the edges of his own household. The Farrington estate glowed like a jewel box on the night of the gathering, every window lit with candles, every hedge along the drive trimmed to perfection for the arrival of carriages carrying the county's finest families. Julian stood near the entrance of the great hall, greeting guests with the practiced smile his aunt had drilled into him since childhood, though his thoughts kept drifting, unwillingly, back to a conversation in his own library 3 nights before. Lady Prudence had spared no effort in arranging this evening. She had personally selected the guest list, ensuring that at least 4 eligible young women of excellent family and fortune would be present, each one primed by her own mother to make a favorable impression on the Duke of Rowan. Among them was Lady Constance Fay, daughter of an earl with extensive land holdings to the north, a woman known throughout the season for her beauty and her sharp tongue, both of which she employed with equal skill. "Your Grace," Lady Constance said, approaching him with a curtsy so precise it might have been measured with a ruler. "How delightful to see you looking so recovered from your unfortunate accident. I heard the most curious version of events, that you were saved by a kitchen maid rather than a proper physician. Surely that cannot be true." Julian's jaw tightened slightly at the question, though he kept his expression neutral. Word of the incident had apparently traveled further than he expected, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until it had become the sort of gossip that amused idle guests at dinner parties. "The wound was minor, Lady Constance, and the person who assisted me acted with more competence than many trained physicians I have encountered." "How fortunate for you," she said, though her tone suggested she found the entire episode faintly ridiculous. "One does hope such competence remains confined to the kitchen, where it belongs." The remark irritated him more than he expected, though he said nothing further, offering only a polite bow before moving toward the ballroom, where the orchestra had begun tuning their instruments for the evening's first dance. Lady Prudence intercepted him halfway across the room, her expression a mixture of hope and warning. "You will dance with Lady Constance first," she said quietly. "It sets the correct tone for the evening, and her father has considerable influence in matters that could benefit the estate." "I am aware of the arrangement, Aunt," Julian said, though something in his chest resisted the idea more strongly tonight than it had at previous gatherings. He could not entirely explain why, except that Lady Constance's comment about kitchen maids had settled uncomfortably in his thoughts. A small cruelty dressed up as polite conversation, the kind of casual dismissal he had heard directed at servants his entire life without ever truly noticing it until now. The evening proceeded, as such evenings always did. Julian danced with Lady Constance as expected, then with 2 other young women his aunt introduced with barely concealed enthusiasm, exchanging polite conversation that touched on weather, travel, and the state of the roads, never once approaching anything resembling genuine connection. He performed his role well enough that Lady Prudence appeared satisfied by midnight, though Julian himself felt only the familiar exhaustion that followed every social obligation he had endured since inheriting his title. Cedric arrived fashionably late, as he preferred, making his entrance with the easy confidence of a man who knew every important person in the room and intended to remind them all of it before the night ended. He found Julian near the refreshment table during a brief lull in the dancing, and his expression carried the particular satisfaction of someone about to deliver news he considered valuable. "I understand you danced with Lady Constance this evening," Cedric said, accepting a glass from a passing footman. "A wise choice, cousin. Her father has been vocal lately about certain financial troubles among the smaller estates, and an alliance with your family would silence quite a bit of unwanted speculation about your own affairs." "My affairs are perfectly stable," Julian said, though the mention of financial speculation caught his attention regardless. "What speculation do you refer to?" "Nothing serious, I am sure," Cedric said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Merely idle talk among certain circles about old debts and old names resurfacing where they are least expected. You know how these things circulate at gatherings like this one, cousin, truth and rumor tangled together, until no one can quite separate them." Julian studied his cousin carefully, aware that Cedric rarely mentioned anything without purpose, though he could not immediately discern what point the man was attempting to make. Before he could press further, Lady Prudence appeared at his elbow once more, this time accompanied by an older gentleman Julian recognized as Lord Farrington himself, their host for the evening. "Your Grace," Lord Farrington said, "I wonder if I might borrow you for a private word regarding a matter of some delicacy." Julian excused himself from Cedric and followed his host to a quieter corner of the estate, where Lord Farrington explained, in careful and measured tones, a concern that had apparently been circulating among certain families in the county. Rumors had emerged, he said, regarding old debts connected to the disgraced Winthrop family, debts that some believed had never been properly settled despite the Earl's fall from society over a decade earlier. Apparently, a distant relation of the family had recently resurfaced, seeking to reclaim whatever remained of the estate's reputation, and questions had arisen about the whereabouts of the Earl's only surviving child, a daughter who had vanished from society entirely after her parents' deaths. Julian listened with polite attention, though the conversation meant little to him beyond idle curiosity about a scandal from years before his own inheritance. He thanked Lord Farrington for the information, promised to keep it in confidence as requested, and returned to the ballroom without connecting the story in any way to the quiet, steady kitchen maid who occupied far too much of his thoughts these days. It was only much later that night, as his carriage rolled back toward his own estate through the dark countryside, that a fragment of memory surfaced unbidden, Nell mentioning her mother's skill with wounds, the careful way she avoided speaking of her family whenever the subject arose, the faint accent in her speech that did not quite match the rough manners one expected from a girl born into service. He dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it appeared, telling himself he was simply tired, allowing an evening full of gossip to color his imagination with connections that did not actually exist. Back at the estate, Nell had spent the evening much as she spent every evening, working alongside Ruth and Agnes to prepare for the household's needs, while their master attended his aunt's carefully orchestrated gathering. She tried not to think about where he was, who he might be dancing with, what young woman of proper birth and fortune Lady Prudence hoped would finally capture his attention. It was foolish to dwell on such things. She reminded herself repeatedly throughout the evening, foolish and dangerous both. "You have been quiet tonight," Ruth observed as they cleaned the kitchen after the last of the evening's work had been completed. "More quiet than usual, even for you." "I am only tired," Nell said, the same excuse she had offered weeks earlier, though this time Ruth did not let it pass so easily. "You are thinking about him," Ruth said gently, "about where he is tonight and who he might be meeting." Nell did not deny it, though she said nothing in response, focusing instead on scrubbing a stubborn stain from the bottom of a copper pot. Ruth sat down beside her, lowering her voice despite the empty kitchen around them. "I do not say this to hurt you," Ruth continued, "but you must understand that whatever is happening between you and the Duke can only end badly, one way or another." Either he marries a lady of proper birth, as he must, and you are left with nothing but memories to torment yourself over, or he does something foolish enough to ruin you both, and you lose the only stable position you have managed to build for yourself since your family's troubles. There is no version of this story that ends well for a girl in your position, Nell. You know this better than anyone. I know, Nell said quietly, setting down the pot and wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the kitchen fire. I have told myself the same thing 100 times these past weeks. And yet every time I convince myself to keep my distance, something happens, a chance meeting, a kind word, and I find myself hoping again despite every warning I have given myself. Then perhaps, Ruth said carefully, you should ask yourself what exactly you are hoping for, because hope without a clear destination is simply another word for heartbreak waiting to happen. Nell had no answer for that, and the two women finished their work in silence, each lost in her own thoughts about the uncertain path that lay ahead. Later that night, alone in the small attic room she shared with two other maids, Nell took out her mother's locket and studied it by candlelight, tracing the faded crest with her thumb as she had done countless times before. She thought of her father, proud and ruined, dead before she turned 14. She thought of her mother, gentle and heartbroken, following him to the grave less than a year later. She thought of the relatives who had taken her in afterward, treating her more as an obligation than a member of the family, until she had finally chosen to disappear into service rather than continue living as an unwanted burden in someone else's home. She had built a new identity for herself in this house, one defined by hard work and quiet reliability rather than birth or fortune. And she had told herself for years that this new identity was enough, that she needed nothing more than the safety of a stable position and the small comforts it provided. But lately, that careful contentment had begun to feel thinner than before, worn away by the memory of gray eyes watching her with genuine interest, by conversations that reminded her of a life she had spent years trying to forget she ever wanted. She closed the locket and tucked it beneath her pillow, extinguishing the candle before climbing into bed, though sleep proved elusive for a long while afterward. Somewhere across the county, in a grand house full of candlelight and expensive silk, the man who had unknowingly unsettled her carefully ordered life was returning home from an evening spent among people who considered themselves his equals, unaware that the person occupying most of his private thoughts waited in a small attic room, wrapped in blankets and uncertainty. Wondering if there existed any version of the future where the distance between them might someday close rather than widen further with each passing day. The following morning brought no answers, only the same familiar routine of work and duty that had structured Nell's days for years. But something had shifted during that long, sleepless night, some quiet resolve forming in the space where doubt and hope had wrestled against each other until exhaustion finally claimed her. Whatever happened next, she decided, she would not spend her remaining years wondering what might have been possible had she allowed herself, just once, to hope a little longer. 2 days later, Julian found himself unable to stop turning Lord Farrington's story over in his mind, though he could not have said precisely why it troubled him so persistently. He sent a discreet letter to his solicitor in London, a careful man named Mr. Pemberton, who had handled the Ashcombe family's legal affairs for over 20 years, asking him quietly to look into the old records concerning the fall of the Winthrop estate. He told himself the inquiry was simple curiosity, nothing more, the sort of idle investigation any gentleman might make after hearing an interesting piece of gossip at a party. He did not examine too closely why his hand had trembled slightly as he sealed the letter, nor why he found himself thinking of gray wool dresses and careful, guarded speech, as he waited for a response that would not arrive for several more days. In the meantime, life at the estate continued much as before, though Julian made a point of visiting the library more often in the evenings, telling himself each time that he simply enjoyed reading in that particular room, though he was rarely disappointed when Nell appeared there on some small errand or another. Their conversations remained brief and proper, always conducted with the careful distance expected between a duke and a servant, and yet Each exchange left him thinking about her long after she had gone, replaying small details of her speech and manner that continued to strike him as inconsistent with her supposed station in life. One evening, he asked her directly, as gently as he could manage, about her family, watching closely for her reaction. "You mentioned your mother taught you to tend wounds," he said, setting aside the book he had been pretending to read. "Was she in service herself before you came to work here?" Nell's hands stilled for a moment over the shelf she had been dusting, though she recovered quickly, continuing her task without turning to face him directly. "My mother came from a family that once held some position in society, my lord, though circumstances changed a great deal before I was old enough to understand them fully. She taught me what she knew before those circumstances took her from me entirely." "What sort of circumstances?" he asked, keeping his tone as light and unassuming as possible, though his attention had sharpened considerably. "The sort that are better left undiscussed, my lord," she said, and something in her voice, a careful firmness beneath the polite deflection, told him clearly enough that she would say no more on the subject, no matter how gently he pressed. He respected the boundary, though it did little to quiet the questions multiplying steadily in his mind. Cedric, meanwhile, had not forgotten the story Lord Farrington shared at the gathering, nor the strange coincidence of his cousin's growing interest in a kitchen maid, whose manner and speech seemed, on closer reflection, somewhat too refined for her supposed background. He made a few careful inquiries of his own among his acquaintances in London, men who dealt in the sort of information that could be bought quietly and used later when the timing proved most advantageous. He learned that the Earl of Winthrop had indeed left behind a daughter at the time of his ruin, a girl who had vanished from every record shortly after her mother's death, swallowed up entirely by the ordinary anonymity of service work somewhere in the countryside. The pieces, Cedric realized with growing satisfaction, were beginning to align themselves into a shape he found extremely useful. If the kitchen maid currently occupying so much of his cousin's private attention proved to be the missing Winthrop heiress, the scandal of the connection, properly revealed at the right moment, could prove disastrous for Julian's reputation, regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. A duke entangled with a servant girl was embarrassing enough on its own. A duke entangled with the daughter of a disgraced and bankrupt earl, a young woman with no dowry, no connections, and a family name still tainted by old debts and scandal, would be considerably worse, particularly if that entanglement became public before Julian had the chance to distance himself from it entirely. Cedric said nothing of his suspicions to anyone, content for the moment to watch and wait, gathering whatever additional evidence might present itself before deciding how best to use the information he had already collected. Patience, he reminded himself, had always served him better than haste, and the situation developing within his cousin's household showed every sign of becoming far more valuable than he could have anticipated only weeks earlier, if only he allowed it enough time to fully ripen. The invitation arrived at the estate on a bright morning 3 weeks later, sealed with the crest of the county's most influential family, the Delacroix, who were hosting a ball to celebrate the engagement of their eldest daughter. Every notable family within a day's travel had been invited, and Lady Prudence declared it the most important social event of the season, one that Julian could not possibly afford to miss. "You will attend, and you will dance more than once this time," she informed him firmly over breakfast, tapping the invitation against the table for emphasis. "Lady Constance will be present, and I have heard whispers that her father intends to make his own announcement soon regarding her future. If you wish to be considered before that door closes entirely, you must show real interest at last, Julian, not merely polite obligation." Julian said little in response, though his mood had grown noticeably heavier in recent days, weighed down by matters that had nothing to do with his aunt's marriage schemes. Mr. Pemberton's letter had finally arrived from London 2 days earlier, confirming in careful legal language what Julian had already begun to suspect. The Earl of Winthrop had indeed left behind a single surviving daughter at the time of his death, a girl named Eleanor, who had disappeared entirely from public record shortly after her mother's passing. The description Pemberton had managed to gather from old household staff who once served the family matched. In every detail Julian could compare. The young woman currently working in his own kitchen under a shortened, humbler version of her name. He had not yet decided what to do with this knowledge, nor how to approach Nell about it without causing her distress or embarrassment. She had clearly chosen to bury her true identity for reasons of her own, likely connected to shame or grief over her family's downfall, and he had no wish to force that painful history back into the light before she was ready to share it herself. And yet the knowledge changed something in how he viewed her, adding weight and context to a connection he had already found difficult to ignore. The night of the Delacroix ball arrived with the sort of grand spectacle expected of such an important occasion. Carriages lined the drive for nearly a mile, and the great hall glittered with more candles than Julian had ever seen assembled in one place, casting warm golden light across silk gowns and polished floors. He greeted his hosts with proper courtesy, endured Lady Prudence's pointed glances toward Lady Constance across the room, and prepared himself for another long evening of performing the role expected of a duke in search of a suitable wife. What he had not expected was the small disaster that unfolded shortly after the second dance began, when one of the household's own servants, sent along to assist with minor errands during the evening, twisted her ankle badly on the stone steps outside the ballroom while carrying refreshments to a side table. The commotion drew several eyes, and Mrs. Whitfield, flustered and short of options given how many other duties demanded her attention that night, quickly dispatched Nell to fill the gap, handing her a tray and instructions to assist wherever needed among the Ashcombe household's small contingent of staff supporting the larger event. Nell had not expected to find herself anywhere near the ballroom floor that evening, and she kept carefully to the edges of the room, delivering refreshments and collecting empty glasses with the quiet efficiency she had perfected over years of similar work. She told herself firmly not to look toward the dance floor, not to search for a particular tall figure among the crowd of dancing couples, though her resolve weakened more than once as the evening progressed. Nell had spent the earlier part of the evening simply grateful for the distraction of extra work, glad to have something to occupy her hands and her attention, rather than standing idle in the servants' quarters, imagining what conversations Julian might be having with Lady Constance beneath the same roof. She had told herself, quite firmly, that she wanted nothing to do with the grand spectacle unfolding beyond the service doors, that her only concern tonight was carrying trays without spilling their contents and returning home before her feet gave out from exhaustion. And yet, despite every effort to remain unseen and unbothered, she found her eyes drifting toward the dance floor more than once, catching brief glimpses of Julian moving through the steps of a formal dance with practiced elegance, his expression carefully composed into the polite mask she had come to recognize as his public face, so different from the warmer, more open expression she had glimpsed during their private conversations in the library. She wondered, watching him bow to Lady Constance at the conclusion of their dance, whether that warmth she believed she had witnessed had been real at all, or simply a trick of candlelight and her own foolish imagination. Cedric noticed her almost immediately, recognizing the plain gray dress and careful posture from his earlier observations at Julian's own estate. An idea began forming in his mind, cruel and calculated in equal measure, as he watched his cousin dance dutifully with Lady Constance, while the mysterious kitchen maid moved unnoticed along the room's edges carrying trays of refreshment. He waited until the current dance concluded, until Julian stood near the refreshment table catching his breath and accepting congratulations from several nearby guests, before making his move. "Cousin," Cedric said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear clearly, "I have heard the most remarkable story about your household, that you employ a kitchen maid so skilled and so devoted that she personally nursed you back to health after your recent accident. Is she perhaps here this evening? I confess I am curious to meet a servant capable of earning such particular attention from a duke." The comment drew immediate interest from the surrounding guests, several of whom turned to look at Julian with expressions ranging from amusement to open curiosity. Julian felt his jaw tighten at his cousin's obvious manipulation, understanding immediately that Cedric intended to create exactly this sort of public spectacle, though he could not yet determine the man's precise motive. "I am not certain what you are implying, Cedric," Julian said carefully, "but any assistance I received was simply a matter of practical necessity, nothing more." "Of course," Cedric said, his smile widening as several other guests, including Lady Constance herself, drifted closer to listen. "And yet I understand this same young woman is here tonight, assisting with the evening service. Perhaps you might introduce her properly, cousin, so that we might all thank her for her devotion to your well-being. It seems only fair, given how much attention you have apparently paid her since." The words landed exactly as Cedric intended, sparking a ripple of quiet laughter among several guests who found the notion amusing. A duke fussing over a common kitchen girl, as though she were a person of consequence. Lady Constance's mouth curved into a thin, knowing smile, and several older matrons exchanged glances that suggested they were already composing the gossip they would share with their own social circles come morning. Julian felt something harden inside him at the sound of that laughter, a stubborn refusal to let his cousin's petty manipulation succeed entirely as intended. He scanned the edges of the room until he found Nell standing near a side table, her tray held carefully in both hands, her expression carefully neutral, though he could see, even from this distance, the tension in her shoulders at suddenly finding herself the subject of aristocratic attention. He crossed the room without further hesitation, aware of the eyes following his every step, aware that whatever he did next would likely become the primary subject of conversation for weeks throughout every drawing room in the county. He stopped before Nell, who set down her tray quickly and offered a proper curtsy, her eyes lifting to his with a mixture of confusion and quiet alarm. "My lord," she said carefully, "is something needed?" The room had grown noticeably quieter around them, guests pausing their own conversations to watch this unexpected exchange unfold, the orchestra between dances providing an almost theatrical hush across the great hall. Julian was aware of Lady Prudence somewhere behind him, likely horrified, and of Cedric's satisfied smile lingering at the edge of his vision, but he found, in that moment, that he cared remarkably little for either reaction. "Miss Winthrop," he said, deliberately using her full surname rather than the shortened version she went by among the staff, watching her eyes widen slightly at the choice. "Would you do me the honor of this next dance?" A ripple of astonished laughter spread immediately through the nearby guests, quiet at first, then growing bolder as the absurdity of the request settled over the room. A duke, asking a kitchen maid to dance, in front of the finest families in the county. Several ladies raised fans to hide their expressions, though their eyes betrayed clear amusement at what they assumed must be some elaborate jest at Cedric's expense, or perhaps simply the strange behavior of a man his aunt had long suspected of eccentricity. Nell felt her face burn with humiliation as the laughter rose around her, understanding immediately that she had become, however unwillingly, the entertainment of the evening. Every instinct urged her to refuse, to retreat quietly back to the safety of her assigned duties before the situation grew any more mortifying than it already was. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something else stirred as well, a stubborn thread of pride she had inherited from a father who had once held his head high even as society stripped away everything he owned. She looked past Julian for a moment, toward Cedric's satisfied smile, toward Lady Constance's barely concealed contempt, toward the sea of curious and mocking faces that had gathered to witness whatever spectacle they believed was about to unfold. Something in their collective certainty, their easy assumption that she would either refuse in embarrassment or accept only to make a fool of herself on the dance floor, ignited a determination she had not felt in years. Somewhere behind her, she thought she heard Ruth's voice, though she could not be certain amid the murmur of the crowd, whispering something that might have been encouragement or might simply have been alarm on her behalf. Agnes's warnings echoed in her memory as well, words about invisible servants keeping their positions longest, about masters who noticed servants bringing nothing but ruin in the end. Every practical instinct she possessed urged her to decline politely, to protect the small, hard-won stability she had built for herself over years of careful, unremarkable service. But she thought, too, of her father, standing tall even as creditors stripped his estate of everything he owned, refusing to the very end to let shame bend his shoulders in front of men who considered themselves his betters. She thought of her mother, teaching her daughter to dance in a drawing room long since sold to strangers, insisting that grace and dignity belonged to a person's character, not to the size of their inheritance. She had buried that girl carefully for over a decade, certain that a leaner Winthrop no longer existed anywhere except in old memories and a tarnished locket hidden beneath her collar. Yet here, in this glittering room full of people already prepared to laugh at her, something of that buried girl stirred back to life, refusing to be quietly diminished one final time. "I would be honored, my lord," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, and she placed her hand in his before her courage could fail her, before the sensible part of her mind still screaming warnings could convince her otherwise. The laughter faltered slightly at her acceptance, uncertain now how to categorize what they were witnessing, and the orchestra, prompted by a quiet word from their host, began the opening notes of a waltz. Julian led her toward the center of the floor, aware of every eye in the room fixed upon them, aware that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine far more than simply the outcome of this single evening. Nell's heart pounded fiercely as she took her position across from him, painfully conscious of her plain gray dress among the silk and jewels surrounding them, conscious of the whispers already spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. For one terrifying moment, she feared her body might betray her entirely, forgetting every lesson her mother had once taught her in a life that felt impossibly distant now, separated from this glittering room by more than a decade of hardship and loss. But then the music swelled around her, familiar despite the years, and her feet began to move almost without conscious thought, guided by muscle memory buried deep beneath years of scrubbing floors and hauling water, memory of another ballroom, another life, when she had been a leaner Winthrop, daughter of an earl, twirling across polished floors in gowns far finer than the one she wore tonight, laughing without a single care for what tomorrow might bring. The laughter in the room began, slowly and unmistakably, to die away. The first steps felt strange beneath Nell's feet, unfamiliar in the way a language learned in childhood feels strange after years of disuse, the shapes of the words still known but rusty with neglect. Julian's hand rested lightly at her waist, his other hand holding hers with careful formality, and for a heartbeat, she feared her body had entirely forgotten the lessons her mother once taught her in a life that felt separated from this one by an unbridgeable distance. Then something clicked into place, the way a key finally finds its lock after fumbling in darkness, and her feet began moving with a confidence that surprised even herself, following the rhythm of the waltz as though no time had passed at all since she last danced across a polished floor. Her posture straightened without conscious effort, her chin lifted, and the careful economy of movement she had learned as a child, taught to conserve energy and grace in equal measure, returned to her limbs like an old friend welcoming her home. Julian felt the change immediately, the subtle shift from a woman merely following his lead to a partner moving with genuine skill and confidence, matching his steps with an ease that spoke of years of proper instruction rather than a single fortunate guess. He looked down at her, searching her face for some explanation, and found instead a fierce, quiet determination in her eyes that told him everything he needed to know without a single word being spoken between them. Around the edges of the dance floor, the laughter that had begun at his invitation continued for only a few more seconds before it started, gradually, and then all at once, to falter into confused silence. Guests who had gathered expecting to witness an embarrassing spectacle found themselves instead watching something entirely unexpected. A kitchen maid moving across the floor with the grace and precision of a woman raised from birth for exactly this purpose, her plain gray dress somehow forgotten amid the elegance of her movement. "You dance," Julian said quietly, low enough that only she could hear him over the music, "like someone who has done this many times before." "I have not danced in over 10 years, my lord," Nell admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, though something in her tone suggested pride rather than embarrassment at the admission. "And yet your feet remember perfectly," he observed, guiding her through a turn that she executed without hesitation, drawing another audible murmur from the watching crowd. "Where did you learn such skill, if I may ask?" Nell hesitated, aware that the truth she had guarded so carefully for over a decade now stood dangerously close to the surface, threatening to spill out before an audience she had never intended to reveal it to. "From my mother, my lord," she said finally, choosing honesty within careful limits. She believed every young woman should know how to carry herself properly, regardless of what circumstances life might later bring. "A wise woman indeed," Julian said, echoing words he had spoken once before in his quiet library, though this time the phrase carried far more weight than either of them could ignore. "I begin to suspect there is a great deal about you, Nell Winthrop, that this household has never properly understood." She said nothing in response, focusing instead on the steps of the dance, though her heart pounded harder with every passing moment, aware that his words carried an unspoken question beneath their surface, an invitation to reveal more than she had ever intended to share with anyone in this new life she had built for herself. As they turned once more beneath the chandeliers, memories rose unbidden in Nell's mind, fragments of a childhood she had spent years trying to forget. She remembered her mother's hands adjusting her posture in a sunlit drawing room, gently correcting the angle of her chin, the placement of her feet, insisting that a lady's bearing revealed her character long before she ever spoke a single word. She remembered her father, laughing warmly as he watched his young daughter practice the same steps she now performed before this glittering crowd, promising her that she would break hearts across every ballroom in the county once she came of age. That promise, like so much else from those early years, had been buried beneath grief and hardship long before it could ever be fulfilled. And yet here, unexpectedly, in a ballroom she had entered only as hired help, that promise seemed to be reasserting itself despite every effort she had made to leave it behind forever. She felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from the strange, overwhelming sensation of two entirely different lives colliding within a single dance. Julian noticed the shift in her expression immediately, the flicker of some private emotion crossing her features before she carefully composed herself once more. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, concern evident beneath the formal cadence required by their public setting. "Quite well, my lord," she said, though her voice carried a fragile quality that suggested otherwise. "This dance has simply brought back memories I had not expected to feel again so vividly." "Good memories, I hope," he said gently. "The very best kind," she replied, "which somehow makes them hurt all the more." He said nothing further, but his hand tightened slightly around hers, a small gesture of reassurance that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed in that crowded, watchful room. Around them, the whispers continued to build, guests turning to their neighbors with wide eyes and hushed voices, several younger daughters watching Nell with something approaching envy rather than scorn, wondering privately whether they themselves could ever move with such natural elegance despite years of expensive dancing masters and careful instruction. Near the edge of the ballroom, Lady Prudence stood frozen in stunned silence, her carefully laid plans for the evening entirely forgotten as she watched her nephew dance with a servant girl who moved, impossibly, like a woman of the finest breeding. Beside her, Lady Constance's expression had shifted from amused contempt to something far more calculating, her sharp eyes studying Nell's every movement with the careful attention of a woman assessing a rival she had not anticipated. Cedric, too, watched the unfolding scene with growing unease, his earlier satisfaction curdling into something closer to alarm, as he realized the public humiliation he had intended for his cousin was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. A moment of unexpected wonder that seemed, with every passing second, to be winning over the very guests he had hoped would mock Julian's impulsive gesture. He had wanted embarrassment, scandal born of ridicule, not this strange and growing fascination spreading through the crowd like a slow, unstoppable tide. "Who is that girl?" he heard one older matron whisper to her companion nearby. "I have never seen anyone move quite like that outside of the finest dancing academies in London." "Perhaps she trained somewhere before falling on hard times," another guest suggested, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "Such things happen more often than polite society likes to admit. Fortunes are lost, families scattered, and sometimes a person of genuine quality ends up in circumstances far beneath what they were born to." The whispers multiplied and spread throughout the room as the dance continued, transforming gradually from cruel amusement into something closer to fascinated speculation. Guests craning their necks for a better view, several younger women watching with expressions of open admiration, rather than the contempt Cedric had hoped to provoke. The orchestra, sensing the shifting mood of the room, extended the waltz longer than originally planned, allowing the moment to stretch on beneath the golden chandeliers. Nell remained acutely aware of every eye upon her, though something had changed within her own chest as well, the fear and humiliation of the dance's opening moments gradually giving way to something unfamiliar and exhilarating. For the first time in over a decade, she felt fully seen, not as an invisible servant expected to perform her duties without notice, but as a person of genuine worth, moving with skill and confidence through a world she had once believed permanently closed to her. "You are smiling," Julian observed as they moved through another turn, his own expression carrying a warmth she had rarely seen him display in public before this moment. "I had forgotten what this felt like," she admitted softly, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. To dance without fear of judgment, simply for the joy of the movement itself. "Then perhaps," Julian said, his voice low and carrying an intensity that made her breath catch slightly, "you should not have to forget it again." The weight of his words settled between them as the music began drawing toward its conclusion, and Nell found herself unable to look away from his steady gray eyes, searching for some sign that he understood the impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting. Some acknowledgement of the vast distance still separating a duke from a servant girl, regardless of how gracefully she might dance across a borrowed ballroom floor. But she found only sincerity there, unclouded by doubt or hesitation, and something in her chest, long guarded and carefully protected, began to soften despite every warning her practical mind continued to whisper. The final notes of the waltz faded, and Julian bowed formally before her, though the gesture carried none of the polite distance he typically maintained during such rituals. Nell curtsied in return, her legs trembling slightly beneath her skirts, uncertain whether from the physical exertion of the dance or from the emotional weight of everything that had just transpired before an audience of the county's most influential families. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, uncertain how to properly respond to a spectacle so far removed from ordinary social expectations. But it grew steadily stronger as more guests joined in, genuine admiration overtaking whatever scandal or amusement they had originally anticipated from the evening's unusual events. Lord Delacroix himself, their host, approached with evident interest, clearly eager to learn more about the mysterious young woman who had transformed what should have been an embarrassing spectacle into the most talked-about moment of his daughter's engagement celebration. "Remarkable," he said, addressing Julian directly while his eyes remained fixed with curiosity on Nell. "I confess, Your Grace, I have rarely witnessed such unexpected skill at any gathering, regardless of the dancer's station. Might I ask where this young woman received her training?" Before Julian could formulate a response that might protect Nell from further scrutiny, a new voice cut through the gathering crowd, sharp and deliberately pitched to carry across the surrounding conversation. "I believe," Cedric said, stepping forward with the calculated precision of a man determined to regain control of a situation rapidly slipping beyond his influence, "that our mysterious dancer's training might have a rather more scandalous origin than any of us initially suspected. Tell me, Miss Winthrop, is that perhaps your true family name, rather than the humble surname you have gone by these past years in my cousin's household?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of renewed whispering throughout the surrounding guests. Nell felt the color drain from her face as every eye in the vicinity turned toward her once again, this time with a different quality of attention entirely, sharp and probing rather than merely curious. "I do not understand your meaning, sir," she said carefully, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor she could not entirely suppress. "Do you not?" Cedric said, his smile carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he held a decisive advantage. "How strange, given that Winthrop happens to be precisely the surname mentioned when the Duke introduced you moments ago for this very dance. A name, if I am not mistaken, once held by a certain disgraced earl whose daughter vanished entirely from society following her parents' unfortunate death some years past. Quite a remarkable coincidence, would you not agree, that a kitchen maid should share such a distinctive name, and possess such distinctly aristocratic training in the art of dance?" The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence, every guest waiting to see how this extraordinary revelation might unfold. Julian stepped closer to Nell instinctively, though he understood with growing certainty that whatever careful secret she had guarded for over a decade now stood dangerously exposed before an audience with neither the discretion nor the sympathy to handle such a revelation gently. Nell's hand rose unconsciously toward her collar, toward the small locket hidden beneath the plain fabric of her borrowed evening attire, and Julian watched the gesture with dawning understanding, aware that the truth Cedric had just spoken aloud before the entire assembled gathering was, in fact, no mere coincidence at all. Lady Constance leaned toward a nearby companion, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "The daughter of a ruined earl working as a common maid," she said, feigning sympathy poorly disguised as scorn. "How very tragic, and how very convenient for her to catch the eye of a duke through such a dramatic little performance." Several guests murmured in agreement, though others, Nell noticed with some surprise, seemed to regard her now with a kind of cautious respect rather than contempt, as though her fall from privilege into service, followed by this unexpected reclamation of grace and skill, had earned her a strange sort of admiration despite the awkwardness of the moment. Lord Delacroix himself appeared genuinely moved by the revelation, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, as he studied the young woman standing before him with such quiet, unshaken dignity despite the weight of every eye in the room. "Is this true?" Julian asked her quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone amid the rising noise around them. "Are you truly the daughter of the Earl of Winthrop?" Nell lifted her chin, drawing on whatever remained of the courage that had carried her through the dance itself, and met his gaze directly, no longer attempting to hide behind careful deflection or half-truths. "I was born Eleanor Winthrop, my lord," she said, her voice clear enough now to carry to those standing nearest them. "My father held that title until his death robbed him of both his fortune and his good name. I have lived as Nell these past 10 years because a servant's anonymity offered more safety and dignity than a ruined name ever could among people eager to remind me daily of everything I had lost." A hush fell across the immediate circle of guests as her words settled over them, the simple honesty of her admission carrying more weight than any elaborate excuse or denial could have managed. Cedric's triumphant smile faltered slightly, clearly unprepared for the quiet strength with which she had claimed her own history rather than crumbling beneath the pressure of public exposure, as he had likely anticipated. "Well," Cedric said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "however sympathetic her circumstances, I hardly think a bankrupt earl's daughter, raised these past years scrubbing floors, represents a suitable match for the Duke of Rowan, regardless of how gracefully she happens to dance." "That," Julian said, his voice suddenly hard and carrying clearly across the surrounding silence, "is a judgment I did not ask you to render, cousin, and one I have no intention of allowing you to make on my behalf." The room seemed to hold its breath collectively at the sharpness in his tone, guests exchanging startled glances as they realized this evening had transformed from a minor scandal into something far more significant, a public confrontation between the Duke and his own cousin, played out before the very families whose opinions mattered most to both men's futures. News of the Delacroix ball spread through the county faster than any carriage could travel, carried instead on the swifter wings of gossip passed between servants, delivered in whispered asides during morning calls, and repeated with growing exaggeration at every drawing-room gathering held over the following week. By the time the story reached its third or fourth retelling, Nell had become, depending on who told the tale, either a tragic heroine reclaiming her rightful place in society or a scheming servant who had cleverly manipulated a lonely duke into public embarrassment for her own advancement. Lady Prudence arrived at the estate the morning after the ball in a state of controlled fury. Her carriage barely stopped before she swept through the front doors demanding an immediate audience with her nephew. Julian met her in his study, bracing himself for the confrontation he had known would come eventually, though he had hoped for a little more time to consider his own next steps before facing his aunt's inevitable objections. "Do you have any idea?" Lady Prudence began without preamble, settling into her usual chair with the rigid posture of a woman barely containing her outrage. "What you have done to this family's reputation? A duke dancing with a servant girl before half the county's most influential families. And now it emerges she is the daughter of a bankrupt, disgraced earl, a connection that will bring nothing but scandal and financial ruin should you pursue this foolishness any further." "I did not plan the events of last evening, Aunt," Julian said carefully, though his tone carried none of the apologetic uncertainty she likely expected. "Cedric orchestrated the entire situation deliberately, hoping to humiliate me before the assembled guests. I refused to allow his cruelty to succeed, nothing more. And the fact that this particular servant happens to be Eleanor Winthrop, missing heiress to a scandal that nearly ruined an entire family a decade ago, this changes nothing in your estimation," Lady Prudence demanded, her voice rising with each word. "Julian, her father left behind debts that were never fully settled, obligations that certain creditors have apparently begun pursuing again, now that the family name has resurfaced in society's attention. Any association with that girl risks entangling this entire estate in financial and legal difficulties we can ill afford, regardless of whatever misguided sympathy you may feel toward her circumstances." Julian had not been aware of the debts his aunt mentioned, and the revelation gave him a moment's pause, though it did nothing to shake the resolve that had settled over him since the previous evening. "What debts do you speak of?" he asked. "Ask your solicitor," Lady Prudence said sharply. "I understand from my own sources that certain parties have already begun making inquiries about the Winthrop estate's remaining obligations, now that word has spread of the daughter's reappearance. Should you pursue any public connection with this girl, you may well find yourself inheriting responsibility for debts that have nothing to do with your own family's affairs, simply through association." The warning troubled Julian more than he cared to admit, though he refused to let his aunt see the full extent of his concern. "I will make inquiries of my own," he said finally, "but I will not abandon a person simply because her family's misfortune might prove inconvenient to my own reputation. That is not the kind of duke I intend to become, Aunt, regardless of what convenience or tradition might otherwise suggest." Lady Prudence studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly despite her evident frustration. "You sound like your father," she said finally, a note of something between exasperation and reluctant admiration entering her voice. "He too believed principle mattered more than practicality, and it cost him dearly more than once throughout his life, though I confess it also earned him respect that money alone could never have purchased. I hope, for your sake, that your own stubbornness proves as fortunate as his eventually did." She left shortly afterward, though her warning about the Winthrop debts lingered heavily in Julian's thoughts throughout the remainder of the day. He sent another urgent letter to Mr. Pemberton, requesting a full and immediate accounting of any outstanding obligations connected to the Winthrop estate, determined to understand exactly what dangers might be gathering around Nell before deciding how best to proceed. Below stairs, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically since the previous night's revelations. Word had reached the household staff almost as quickly as it had spread through the county's drawing rooms, and Nell found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from every direction. Some curious, some resentful, and a few, surprisingly, sympathetic in ways she had not expected. "I always knew there was something different about you," Agnes admitted grudgingly as they worked together in the kitchen that morning, her earlier warnings about invisible servants seemingly forgotten in light of this dramatic new development. "The way you carried yourself, the way you spoke when you thought no one important was listening. I should have guessed you came from better circumstances than you let on." "It made no difference to how I worked," Nell said quietly, uncomfortable with the sudden attention after years of carefully cultivated invisibility. "I am still the same person I was yesterday, Agnes, regardless of what name I was born with." "Perhaps," Agnes said, though her tone suggested doubt, "but the world rarely sees it that way, girl. You would do well to remember that, whatever happens next between you and the master." Ruth, at least, remained genuinely supportive throughout the difficult days that followed, though even she could not entirely hide her worry about what the future might hold for her friend. "Other servants are saying all sorts of things," she confided one evening as they prepared for bed in their shared attic room. "Some believe you planned this deliberately, that you deceived everyone about your true identity in hopes of eventually catching the Duke's attention. Others believe you are entirely innocent, simply a victim of circumstances beyond your control. I do not know which version troubles me more, honestly, since neither seems to consider what you yourself might actually want from any of this." "I do not know what I want," Nell admitted, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her mother's locket clutched tightly in one hand. "Yesterday, I wanted nothing more than to keep my secret buried, to continue living quietly as Nell, safe from the shame and pity my true name has always attracted. Now that the secret is exposed, I find myself uncertain what safety even means anymore, or whether I truly want to return to the careful invisibility I maintained for so long." "And the Duke," Ruth asked gently, "what do you want from him now that everyone knows the truth of who you are?" Nell had no immediate answer for that question, though her thoughts returned, unbidden, to the warmth in Julian's eyes as they danced together, to the quiet intensity of his voice when he had defended her honor before Cedric and the assembled guests. Whatever complicated feelings had grown between them during their private conversations in the library now existed in full public view, subject to scrutiny and judgment from every direction, and she could not yet determine whether that exposure had strengthened or destroyed whatever fragile connection they had managed to build. 3 days after the ball, a visitor arrived at the estate whom Nell had not expected to see again in her lifetime. Margaret Price, an elderly woman who had once served as her mother's closest friend and confidant before the family's fall from grace, requested an audience with the young Duke, claiming information relevant to the recent scandal involving his household. Julian, curious about this unexpected connection to Nell's past, agreed to receive her in his study, and asked that Nell join them as well, understanding that whatever this visitor had to share likely concerned her more directly than himself. "Eleanor," Margaret said warmly upon seeing Nell enter the room, tears gathering in her eyes despite her evident effort to maintain composure. "I scarcely believed the rumors when they first reached me, but here you are, alive and grown into a woman your mother would have been so proud to see. I have thought of you often these past years, wondering what had become of you after your family's tragedy, though I confess I never expected to find you again under such extraordinary circumstances." "Mrs. Price," Nell said, her own voice thick with unexpected emotion at seeing a familiar face from a childhood she had believed entirely lost to her. "I did not know you were still living nearby. I would have sought you out myself had I known." "I moved away shortly after your mother's passing," Margaret explained, unable to bear remaining in a place so filled with memories of happier times before everything fell apart. "I only returned to the county recently, to care for my late husband's remaining property, and I confess the news of your reappearance has followed me everywhere I have gone since arriving." Julian listened to this exchange with careful attention, aware that Margaret Price's presence offered an opportunity to understand more fully the circumstances of Nell's past, information that might prove crucial in navigating whatever difficulties lay ahead for both of them. "Mrs. Price," he said gently, "might I ask what you know of the debts my aunt has warned me still burden the Winthrop estate? I wish to understand fully what obligations, if any, might affect Aline's situation going forward." Margaret's expression grew troubled at the question. "The debts your aunt speaks of were never truly the Earl's own doing, Your Grace, though the shame of them fell entirely upon his shoulders regardless. His business partner at the time, a man named Aldrich Fenwick, embezzled significant funds from their shared ventures before disappearing entirely, leaving the Earl to answer for obligations he had never personally incurred. He spent his final years attempting to clear his name and recover what losses he could, but died before achieving either goal, leaving his family exposed to creditors who cared little for the true circumstances behind the debts they sought to collect. This revelation struck Julian with considerable force, suggesting that Nell's father had been more victim than villain in the scandal that had destroyed his family, a distinction that changed considerably how society might eventually come to view her circumstances, should the true story become more widely known. "Do you know what became of this Fenwick?" he asked. "I do not, Your Grace," Margaret admitted. "He vanished entirely after the scandal broke, and no one I know of ever discovered where he fled or what became of his ill-gotten fortune. Some believed he left the country entirely, perhaps to the Americas, though nothing was ever confirmed." The conversation continued for some time longer, Margaret sharing additional memories of Nell's childhood and her parents' character, painting a picture of a family brought low by betrayal rather than genuine wrongdoing, a distinction that offered Nell a strange, bittersweet comfort even as it raised new questions about a mystery she had assumed long buried alongside her parents themselves. Long after Margaret departed, promising to visit again soon, Julian remained deep in thought, turning over the possibility that clearing the Winthrop name entirely might not prove as impossible as his aunt had feared. Should the true architect of the family's ruin ever be properly identified and held accountable for his actions? Across the county, Cedric spent those same days nursing a fury he took great care to hide from anyone who might report his mood back to Julian. The public confrontation at the Delacroix ball had not unfolded as he intended, and rather than diminishing his cousin's standing, the incident seemed instead to be generating a strange wave of public sympathy for both Julian and the mysterious kitchen maid turned lost heiress. Cedric understood, with growing bitterness, that he would need a far more decisive strategy if he hoped to prevent this unlikely romance from threatening his own long-held ambitions toward the family title. He traveled to London within the week, seeking out contacts among the city's more disreputable circles, men who dealt in information, debts, and influence that respectable society preferred to pretend did not exist. Through careful and expensive inquiries, he learned two pieces of information that struck him as immediately useful. First, that the debts attached to the old Winthrop estate had, in fact, been quietly purchased some years earlier by an anonymous buyer, someone with sufficient resources to acquire the obligations without drawing attention, and sufficient patience to hold them without pressing for payment until now. Second, and more troubling still, that inquiries similar to his own had recently been made by another party regarding the whereabouts of a man named Aldrich Fenwick, suggesting that Cedric was not the only person interested in unraveling the old scandal's remaining secrets. This second discovery unsettled him more than he cared to admit. If someone else was actively searching for Fenwick, someone with both the means and motivation to succeed where a decade of silence had otherwise prevailed, then the truth behind the Winthrop family's ruin might soon become public knowledge, regardless of Cedric's own preferences in the matter. Should that truth exonerate the old Earl entirely, restoring at least a measure of dignity to his daughter's name, Cedric's hopes of using the scandal against Julian's growing attachment would collapse entirely, replaced instead by a narrative of tragic injustice finally corrected, precisely the sort of romantic story society loved to celebrate rather than condemn. He resolved, therefore, to move more quickly than whatever unknown party had begun this same investigation. If he could locate Fenwick first, and ensure that whatever the man revealed served his own interests rather than Julian's, he might yet salvage some advantage from a situation that had already slipped considerably further from his control than he found comfortable. He dispatched 2 of his most trusted associates that same week, instructing them to search the port records and shipping manifests from a decade earlier, hoping to trace whatever trail Fenwick might have left behind during his hurried departure from English shores. Whatever the outcome of that search, Cedric understood clearly that time had become a resource he could no longer afford to waste carelessly. The longer Julian's attachment to Nell continued unchallenged, the more difficult it would become to separate them before matters progressed towards something far more permanent and far more damaging to Cedric's own long-cherished ambitions. Mr. Pemberton's reply arrived nearly 2 weeks after Julian's urgent inquiry, delivered by a courier who had traveled through the night to ensure its swift arrival. Julian read the letter twice through before summoning Nell to his study, understanding immediately that its contents would change the course of events far more dramatically than either of them could have anticipated only a month earlier. "The debts have indeed been purchased," he told her once she arrived, gesturing for her to sit across from his desk rather than standing as propriety typically demanded of servants, a small gesture that had become increasingly natural between them despite the scandal still swirling through county gossip. Pemberton discovered the identity of the buyer after considerable effort. It was your own distant cousin, a man named Harold Winthrop, who inherited a modest fortune some years ago and has apparently spent much of it quietly acquiring your father's old obligations, one creditor at a time, over the past several years. Nell's brow furrowed in confusion. Why would he do such a thing? "I have no memory of any cousin, by that name, showing the slightest interest in our family's fate after my father's death." "Pemberton believes," Julian continued, "that Harold intended to use the debts eventually as leverage, perhaps hoping to locate you and offer forgiveness of the obligations in exchange for some advantageous arrangement. A marriage to his own son, perhaps, or simply your gratitude and loyalty once he successfully positioned himself as your family's rescuer. It seems he had been searching for you for some time, unaware that you had already found a measure of stability here, under a different name." The revelation left Nell feeling unsettled in ways she struggled to fully articulate, the strange sensation of having been simultaneously abandoned and quietly pursued by family she had believed entirely lost to her circumstances. "What does this mean for my situation now?" she asked. "It means," Julian said carefully, "that the debts, while real, were never truly a threat requiring urgent resolution, at least not in the manner my aunt originally feared. Harold has no interest in ruining you further, only in eventually claiming credit for your rescue." More importantly, however, Pemberton's inquiries also uncovered information regarding the man responsible for your father's original ruin. He explained then what his solicitor had discovered, that Aldrich Fenwick had indeed fled to the Americas following his embezzlement of the shared business ventures, settling eventually in a port city under an assumed name, where he had built a modest fortune trading in goods that required little scrutiny of their origins. More significantly, Pemberton had located correspondence, preserved among old business records, that clearly documented Fenwick's fraudulent activities, and definitively cleared the Earl of Winthrop of any deliberate wrongdoing in the scandal that had destroyed his family's reputation. "This could restore your father's name," Julian said quietly, watching her carefully for her reaction. "Properly presented before the right authorities and social circles, this evidence could clear the Winthrop family of the shame that has followed you these past 10 years. Nell felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the possibility of a vindication she had never dared hope might actually arrive after so many years of quiet grief and careful concealment. "Why would you go to such lengths for me?" she asked softly. "This is not your burden to carry, my lord." Julian rose from his desk and moved around to stand before her, his expression carrying none of the careful formality he typically maintained in public settings. "Because I have come to care for you, Nell, more deeply than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone since my father's death left me convinced that duty and genuine affection could never coexist within the life expected of a man in my position. You have shown me otherwise, through nothing more than honesty and quiet courage, and I find I am no longer willing to let convention or scandal determine what I do with the feelings you have awakened in me." Before Nell could respond to this unexpected declaration, a sharp knock interrupted them, and a footman entered with visible urgency, announcing that Cedric Vane had arrived unannounced, accompanied by two unfamiliar gentlemen who claimed urgent business requiring the Duke's immediate attention. Julian frowned at the interruption, exchanging a brief glance with Nell before instructing the footman to show the visitors into the drawing room, where he intended to deal with whatever new complication his cousin had arranged with as much composure as he could manage. Cedric's expression carried a triumphant edge as Julian entered the drawing room, and the two strangers accompanying him, dressed in the practical clothing of men accustomed to travel rather than the fashionable attire typical of county society, watched the proceedings with careful, assessing eyes. "Cousin," Cedric said, "allow me to introduce Mr. Grimsby and Mr. Alcott, investigators I retained some weeks ago to look into certain matters connected to your household's recent scandal. They have returned with information I believe you will find most illuminating." Julian's stomach tightened with unease, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What information could possibly require such dramatic presentation, Cedric?" "We located Aldrich Fenwick, Your Grace," Mr. Grimsby said, stepping forward with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Living under a different name in Boston, considerably wealthy from ventures he began after fleeing England some years ago. We interviewed him personally regarding the circumstances of his departure and the business dealings that preceded it." Julian felt a flicker of hope at this news, believing initially that the investigators had simply confirmed what Pemberton's own inquiries had already established. But Cedric's expression, still carrying that same satisfied edge, suggested something more complicated awaited in whatever revelation these men had traveled so far to deliver. "And what did this Fenwick tell you?" Julian asked carefully. "A rather different story than you might expect, Your Grace," Mr. Alcott said, exchanging a glance with his colleague before continuing. "According to Fenwick's own account, the Earl of Winthrop was not merely an innocent victim of his business partner's fraud, as certain parties have apparently begun suggesting. Fenwick claims the Earl was fully aware of and complicit in the fraudulent schemes from their earliest stages, participating willingly in exchange for a share of the illicit profits, only feigning ignorance once their activities began attracting unwanted attention from creditors and authorities." The room fell into stunned silence at this claim, and Julian glanced toward the doorway, where he realized with a sinking feeling that Nell had followed him from the study, and now stood frozen at the threshold, having clearly overheard every word of this devastating accusation against her father's memory. "That is a lie," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury that silenced the room entirely. "My father was many things, but he was not a thief, and he was not complicit in stealing from the very partnerships he trusted with everything his family possessed." "Forgive me, Miss Winthrop," Mr. Grimsby said, his tone carrying a professional detachment that did nothing to soften the cruelty of his words, "but Fenwick provided sworn testimony to this effect, along with documentation he claims supports his account. Whether the truth ultimately favors your father or condemns him, that determination will likely require considerably more investigation than either of us is qualified to conduct ourselves." Cedric watched this exchange with evident satisfaction, understanding clearly that whatever sympathy society had begun extending toward Nell following the ball would now face serious challenge, replaced instead by renewed doubt and suspicion about the true nature of her family's disgrace. "I thought it only fair," he said smoothly, "that you should possess this information before proceeding any further with whatever intentions you may harbor regarding Miss Winthrop's future, cousin. A duke's reputation cannot survive entanglement with a family whose scandal may prove considerably more complicated than simple misfortune." Julian felt anger building steadily within his chest, though he recognized the careful trap his cousin had constructed, a trap that would only tighten further should he respond with the fury he genuinely felt. "Thank you for bringing this matter to my attention, Cedric," he said with forced calm. "I will, of course, need to verify these claims thoroughly before drawing any conclusions." Fenwick's testimony alone, offered by a man who fled the country to avoid the consequences of his own actions, hardly constitutes conclusive proof of anything beyond his own continued willingness to shift blame elsewhere. "Of course," Cedric said, though his smile suggested he had already achieved precisely the effect he intended, planting sufficient doubt to poison whatever public sympathy remained for Nell's cause, regardless of how the deeper truth might eventually be resolved. He gathered his investigators and departed shortly afterward, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed down upon the drawing room like an physical weight. Nell stood motionless near the doorway for a long moment after Cedric's departure, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly at her sides. "What if it is true?" she whispered finally, more to herself than to Julian. "What if my father truly was complicit in everything that destroyed our family, and I have spent 10 years mourning a man who did not deserve the grief I carried for him?" Julian crossed the room quickly and took her hands in his own, steadying their trembling with the warmth of his grip. "We do not yet know the truth, Nell, and I refuse to accept the word of a man who fled his own crimes as final judgment on your father's character. Pemberton's earlier evidence, the correspondence documenting Fenwick's fraud, still exists and still requires proper examination. We will pursue this matter until we uncover whatever truth actually exists, regardless of how long that pursuit requires or how many obstacles Cedric attempts to place before us." "And if the truth proves as damning as Fenwick claims?" she asked, searching his face for honesty rather than comfortable reassurance. "Then we will face that truth together," Julian said firmly, "and I will love you regardless of what your father may or may not have done, because you are not responsible for his choices, only for your own character, which I have watched demonstrate nothing but honesty and courage since the moment I first met you in that stable yard." The declaration hung in the air between them, unexpected and entirely sincere, and Nell felt something within her chest finally break open after years of careful, guarded restraint, releasing emotions she had suppressed for far too long beneath the weight of grief, shame, and quiet survival. "I must know the truth," she said finally, wiping away the tears that had gathered without her noticing. "Not for society's approval, and not even entirely for my father's memory, but for myself. I have spent 10 years uncertain whether to mourn him or resent him, and I cannot continue building any future with you or otherwise, while that uncertainty remains unresolved." "Then we will find the truth together," Julian said. "I will send Pemberton to speak with Fenwick directly, armed with the correspondence we already possess, and demand he account for the contradictions between his sworn testimony and the documented evidence of his own fraud. A man who has already proven himself a liar, and a thief has little credibility to spare when confronted with proof of his earlier crimes." They spent the remainder of that afternoon in the study, reviewing every scrap of correspondence Pemberton had gathered, searching for details that might strengthen their case before sending the solicitor across the ocean to confront Fenwick directly. Nell found herself grateful, despite the difficulty of the task, for something concrete to focus her attention upon, a purposeful pursuit of truth rather than the helpless waiting that had characterized so much of her life since her family's fall from grace. That evening, Margaret Price returned to the estate, having heard through the rapid channels of county gossip about Fenwick's damaging accusations. She arrived visibly distressed, insisting on speaking with both Nell and Julian immediately regarding a detail she believed she had overlooked during her earlier visit. "I nearly forgot," she said, settling into a chair with evident agitation, "that your mother once showed me a letter, Eleanor, written by your father shortly before his death, in which he described his suspicions about Fenwick's activities in considerable detail. He believed Fenwick intended to frame him should their fraud ever be discovered, precisely to protect himself from consequences he knew he thoroughly deserved. Your mother kept that letter among her most treasured possessions, believing it might someday prove necessary to clear your father's name should the scandal ever resurface. "Do you know what became of that letter?" Julian asked urgently, recognizing immediately the significance of such evidence, written in the Earl's own hand before any accusation had yet been leveled against him, predicting precisely the defense Fenwick would eventually attempt to mount. "I believe your mother left it among her personal effects," Margaret said, turning to Nell, "which would have passed to whichever relations took you in after her passing. Do you know what became of your parents' belongings during that difficult time?" Nell's mind raced backward through painful memories she had spent years trying to avoid revisiting, recalling distant relations who had shown little patience for sentiment or preserved memorabilia from a family whose disgrace they considered an embarrassment rather than a tragedy worth honoring. "My aunt's household disposed of most of my mother's possessions shortly after I came to live with them," she said slowly, considering such reminders inappropriate for a family attempting to distance itself from scandal. "But I recall a small trunk of personal papers that my aunt kept locked away rather than destroyed outright, perhaps believing they held some future value, or simply unable to bring herself to burn her own sister's final possessions entirely." "Does your aunt still reside in the county?" Julian asked, hope evident in his voice for the first time since Cedric's investigators had delivered their troubling news. "She does," Nell said, "though I have not spoken with her in over 8 years, not since I left her household to seek my own position in service rather than continue as an unwelcome burden upon her charity." "Then perhaps," Julian said, "it is time you paid your aunt a visit, regardless of how uncomfortable that reunion might prove. If your father's letter still exists among those preserved papers, it may provide precisely the evidence needed to expose Fenwick's lies once and for all, and restore the Winthrop name to whatever dignity it deserves." The journey to her aunt's estate took less than an hour by carriage, though Nell felt as though she were traveling backward through 10 years of carefully buried memory with every mile that passed. Julian insisted on accompanying her, unwilling to let her face this difficult reunion alone, and Nell found herself grateful beyond words for his steady presence beside her as the familiar countryside of her childhood came into view. Her aunt, Lady Beatrice Thornfield, received them with visible surprise and no small measure of discomfort, clearly unsettled by the unexpected combination of her long-estranged niece and a duke arriving together at her modest country home. "Eleanor," she said stiffly, ushering them into a small parlor, "I confess I did not expect to see you again, particularly not in such distinguished company." "I would not have come, Aunt, if the matter were not urgent," Nell said, keeping her tone carefully neutral despite the complicated emotions churning beneath the surface of this long-overdue reunion. "I understand you kept a trunk of my mother's papers after her death, rather than disposing of them entirely as you did with most of her other possessions. I need to know if that trunk still exists, and whether a particular letter might be found among its contents." Lady Beatrice's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: guilt, defensiveness, and finally, something closer to resignation. "The trunk remains in the attic," she admitted. "I could never quite bring myself to burn it entirely, though I told myself for years that I kept it only out of practical thrift rather than sentiment. What letter do you seek?" Nell explained Margaret Price's account of the letter her father had written, describing his suspicions about Fenwick's fraudulent activities before his death, and the potential significance such evidence might hold in clearing his name against the damaging accusations Fenwick had recently made. Lady Beatrice listened with growing attention, her earlier defensiveness giving way gradually to genuine interest, as she processed the possibility that her brother-in-law's ruined reputation might, after all these years, finally be restored. "I always believed there was more to your father's downfall than the story society preferred to tell," she admitted quietly. "He was not a perfect man, Eleanor, but he was not the villain his creditors made him out to be either. Come, let us search the attic together. If such a letter exists, we shall find it." The search took the better part of an hour, sorting through decade-old papers thick with dust, and the particular musty smell of long-forgotten memories. But eventually, tucked within a bundle of correspondence tied with faded ribbon, Nell's trembling hands uncovered a letter addressed to her mother in her father's distinctive handwriting, dated mere weeks before his death. She read it aloud to the small gathering assembled in the dusty attic, her voice growing steadier with each line as the letter's contents confirmed everything Margaret Price had described. The Earl had written of his growing suspicions regarding his business partner's activities, detailing specific transactions that troubled him and expressing fear that Fenwick intended to shift blame entirely onto himself, should their shared ventures ever face scrutiny from authorities or creditors. The letter's tone carried genuine anguish and moral clarity, the words of a man who understood he was being maneuvered into a position of blame for crimes committed by someone he had trusted, yet who had not discovered the full extent of Fenwick's deception until it was too late to prevent his own ruin. "This is exactly what we need," Julian said, carefully taking the letter to examine its handwriting and dating more closely. Combined with the correspondence Pemberton already gathered documenting Fenwick's actual fraudulent transactions, this letter, written before any accusation had been leveled against your father, proves conclusively that he suspected and feared Fenwick's schemes rather than participating willingly in them. No honest court or reasonable society could continue crediting Fenwick's self-serving accusations against such compelling contrary evidence. Lady Beatrice, watching this exchange with evident emotion, reached out to grasp Nell's hand for the first time in over 8 years. "I am sorry, Eleanor," she said quietly, "for the coldness with which my household treated you after your parents' deaths. Grief and shame make poor counselors, and I allowed both to override whatever affection I should have shown my own sister's child. I hope, in time, you might find it within yourself to forgive an old woman's failures, whatever the outcome of this matter proves to be." Nell felt tears gathering again, though these carried a different quality than the grief and fear of recent weeks, something closer to healing long overdue. "I forgive you, Aunt," she said softly. "We were both simply trying to survive circumstances neither of us fully understood at the time." Armed with this crucial evidence, Julian dispatched Pemberton across the ocean within days, carrying both the newly discovered letter and the earlier correspondence documenting Fenwick's fraud, along with detailed instructions to confront the man directly and demand a full retraction of his damaging accusations against the deceased Earl. The journey required several weeks to complete, weeks during which Nell and Julian's relationship continued deepening, despite the uncertainty still hanging over both their futures. Cedric, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate as his earlier scheme showed signs of unraveling. Word had spread through county gossip about the newly discovered letter, and public opinion, which had briefly turned against Nell following Fenwick's initial accusations, began shifting once more toward sympathy as details of her father's suspicions and eventual betrayal became more widely known. Sensing his advantage slipping away entirely, Cedric made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his position, arranging a private meeting with Lady Constance Fay to propose an alliance that might yet secure his own future regardless of how the Winthrop scandal ultimately resolved. "Your father seeks influential connections for his business ventures," Cedric said carefully during their meeting, held discreetly at a mutual acquaintance's estate. "I can offer that influence along with a title that, while not currently mine, remains a genuine possibility should certain circumstances develop favorably." Julian's continued attachment to a servant girl, regardless of her recently discovered lineage, creates real vulnerability that a man in my position might reasonably exploit toward mutual advantage. Lady Constance, whose own pride had suffered considerably from Nell's unexpected triumph at the Delacroix ball, found herself tempted by Cedric's proposal, though she remained too shrewd to commit entirely without further consideration of the risks involved. "What precisely do you propose, Mr. Vane?" she asked carefully. "A public statement," Cedric said, "delivered at the appropriate moment, questioning the authenticity of whatever evidence Julian's solicitor eventually produces from America." Combined with your own testimony regarding certain improprieties you might claim to have witnessed between the Duke and his servant, we could create sufficient doubt to permanently damage both their reputations, regardless of whatever truth ultimately emerges regarding the Earl's guilt or innocence. Lady Constance considered this proposal for several long moments, weighing her wounded pride against the genuine risk of associating herself with what amounted to a deliberate campaign of slander against a duke and his intended companion. Ultimately, self-preservation won out over spite, and she declined Cedric's invitation with careful diplomatic language that nonetheless made her position entirely clear. I find myself unwilling to stake my own reputation on a scheme so likely to unravel once your cousin's evidence arrives from America, she said finally. Whatever satisfaction I might gain from seeing that servant girl humbled further seems poor compensation for the scandal I would risk should your plan fail, as I suspect it likely will. I bid you good day, Mr. Vane, and I would advise you consider more carefully the company you keep going forward. Her refusal left Cedric with dwindling options as Pemberton's ship finally returned from America nearly 6 weeks after his initial departure, carrying with him a sworn affidavit from Fenwick himself, obtained under considerable legal pressure once confronted with irrefutable evidence of his own fraudulent activities. Faced with the possibility of extradition and prosecution should he continue maintaining his false accusations, Fenwick had finally admitted the truth in full, confessing to the entirety of his original scheme and formally retracting every claim he had made against the deceased Earl of Winthrop's character. Julian arranged for this affidavit's contents to be shared widely throughout county society, ensuring that every family who had heard Fenwick's original damaging accusations now received equally thorough documentation of their falsehood. The reversal in public opinion proved swift and decisive, transforming Nell's story once again, this time permanently from scandal into vindication, her father's memory restored to whatever dignity a decade of unjust shame had stripped away, and her own courage throughout the entire ordeal earning genuine admiration from families who had once been quick to mock her humble circumstances. Lady Prudence, upon learning the full truth, arrived at the estate with an entirely different demeanor than her previous visits had displayed. "I owe you an apology, my dear," she said to Nell, extending a hand that carried none of the earlier coldness Nell had come to expect from her interactions with Julian's formidable aunt. "I judged you too harshly, allowing concern for practical matters to override proper consideration of your genuine character. Julian was right to see something in you that the rest of us initially failed to recognize." "Thank you, Lady Prudence," Nell said graciously, though she found herself genuinely moved by the older woman's willingness to acknowledge her earlier misjudgment. "I understand your concerns were never truly malicious, only protective of a nephew you clearly love a great deal." "Precisely so," Lady Prudence agreed, "and it is precisely because I love him that I am pleased to see him has found someone capable of matching both his intelligence and his stubborn devotion to principle over convenience. I dare say you two are rather perfectly suited to each other, whatever unlikely circumstances first brought you together." Cedric, faced with the complete collapse of his scheme and the growing suspicion of several family members who had begun questioning his role in spreading Fenwick's original false accusations, quietly withdrew from county society for a time, his ambitions toward the family title effectively ended by his own transparent machinations. Julian, magnanimous in victory, chose not to pursue further public condemnation of his cousin's actions, though the family relationship between them remained permanently altered by the events of that difficult season. Several months later, on a bright autumn afternoon with the estate's gardens still holding the last vibrant colors of the season, Julian proposed marriage to Nell in the very library where their quiet friendship had first begun to deepen into something far more significant. She accepted without hesitation, and their wedding, held the following spring, drew guests from across the county eager to witness the union between a duke and the woman whose courage and grace had captured both his heart and society's genuine respect. Eleanor Winthrop, Duchess of Rowan, would go on to become known throughout the county, not merely for the remarkable story of her rise from kitchen maid to nobility, but for the genuine kindness and practical wisdom she brought to her new position, remembering always the years of hardship that had shaped her character long before privilege ever returned to reclaim her. She maintained her friendship with Ruth, who came to serve as her personal companion rather than a mere household maid, and she ensured that Agnes and the rest of the household staff who had known her during her years of humble service always received the respect and consideration too often denied to those who labored quietly behind the grandeur of noble households. The wedding itself unfolded beneath a canopy of golden autumn leaves in the same gardens where Julian had proposed. The estate transformed with flowers and ribbons for an occasion that drew far more genuine warmth from its guests than the careful, calculated gatherings Lady Prudence had once arranged in hopes of securing a suitable match for her nephew. Margaret Price sat proudly among the honored guests, having become something of a second mother to Eleanor throughout the preceding months, while Lady Beatrice, reconciled fully with her niece, wept openly during the ceremony despite her earlier reputation for stern composure. Ruth stood nearby throughout the celebration, resplendent in a new gown Eleanor had insisted on gifting her for the occasion, and the two friends shared a quiet, knowing smile as the ceremony concluded, remembering countless nights spent scrubbing pots and worrying over uncertain futures in a kitchen that now felt impossibly distant from the grandeur surrounding them. Even Agnes attended, gruffly wiping away tears she insisted were merely irritation from the autumn wind, though no one in attendance believed her protest for a moment. Lord Delacroix, whose ball had first set this remarkable chain of events into motion, offered a toast during the wedding breakfast that captured the sentiment shared by most of the assembled guests. "I have attended a great many society weddings throughout my years," he said, raising his glass toward the newly married couple, "but I confess none has moved me quite so deeply as this one. We often speak of noble birth as though it alone determines a person's worth, yet here stands a woman who lost everything through no fault of her own, endured years of hardship with quiet dignity, and reclaimed not merely her name, but the genuine respect and affection of everyone fortunate enough to witness her journey. If that is not true nobility, I confess I do not know what deserves the title instead." The guests raised their glasses in enthusiastic agreement, and Eleanor felt Julian's hand tighten warmly around her own beneath the table, both of them understanding that whatever challenges still lay ahead in their shared future, they would face them together, having already weathered a storm that might easily have destroyed a less resilient connection between two people from such vastly different circumstances. Cedric did not attend the wedding, having withdrawn to a distant property inherited through his mother's side of the family, where he lived out subsequent years in relative obscurity, his ambitions toward the Ashcombe title permanently extinguished by his own scheming, though Julian, true to his character, ensured his cousin retained sufficient income to live comfortably despite everything that had transpired between them. Some acts of forgiveness, Julian believed, mattered more for the person extending them than for the person receiving their benefit, and he had no wish to carry bitterness forward into the new chapter of his life that Eleanor's presence had made possible. Lady Constance eventually married a wealthy merchant's son from the northern counties, a match that raised eyebrows among the more traditional families, but suited her ambitious nature considerably better than the cold, careful courtship she had once attempted with Julian. She and Eleanor encountered each other occasionally at subsequent social gatherings throughout the following years, their interactions carrying a polite, distant civility that acknowledged their earlier rivalry without ever quite resolving into genuine friendship, though neither woman seemed to mind the arrangement particularly. And on quiet evenings, when the demands of her new position allowed a moment's peaceful reflection, Eleanor would sometimes take out her mother's old locket, no longer hidden beneath a servant's plain collar but worn openly as a treasured reminder of the family whose name had finally been restored to its rightful dignity. And she would think of that first terrible, wonderful night when a ballroom full of laughter had fallen silent before the simple, undeniable truth that grace and worth had never depended upon fortune or birth, but upon the quiet strength of character that no amount of hardship had ever truly managed to diminish. 2 years into their marriage, a letter arrived at the Ashcombe estate bearing a foreign postmark that immediately caught Alina's attention, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the return address listing a solicitor's office in Boston. She opened it in the privacy of her morning room, curious what business might connect her new life to a city she had only ever heard mentioned in connection with Aldrich Fenwick's disgraceful flight from England years earlier. The letter, she discovered with growing astonishment, came from Fenwick himself, now an elderly man reportedly suffering from failing health, who had apparently spent his final years wrestling with guilt over the ruin he had brought upon her family. He wrote not to ask forgiveness, understanding perhaps that such a request would be presumptuous given the extent of his crimes, but rather to inform her of a modest sum he wished to bequeath toward whatever charitable purpose she believed might honor her father's memory. A final, imperfect attempt at restitution from a man who had spent decades running from the consequences of his own choices. Alina discussed the matter with Julian that evening, uncertain how to feel about this unexpected communication from the man whose betrayal had shaped so much of her difficult childhood. "I do not know whether to feel anger or pity," she admitted, staring at the letter spread across the desk between them. "He destroyed my family entirely. And yet here he is, an old man seeking some measure of peace before facing whatever awaits him beyond this life." "Perhaps both feelings can exist together," Julian suggested gently. "Anger for what he took from you does not require you to deny whatever genuine remorse he may feel now, nor does accepting his gesture of restitution mean you have forgiven the full weight of his original betrayal. What would you like to do with the funds he offers?" Alina considered the question carefully over the following days, eventually deciding to establish a modest charitable fund dedicated to assisting servants and household staff who found themselves, through no fault of their own, suddenly without position or reference, the very circumstances that had once threatened to leave her destitute and vulnerable following her own family's ruin. She named the fund after her mother, believing that honoring the woman who had taught her grace and resilience mattered more than any gesture connected directly to Fenwick's guilty conscience. The fund grew steadily over subsequent years, supported not only by Fenwick's initial contribution, but by Alina's own careful stewardship and the growing reputation she developed throughout the county as a duchess who understood intimately the struggles faced by those who served in grand households like her own. She insisted on personally reviewing many of the fund's applications, remembering always her own desperate circumstances following her parents' deaths, and ensuring that assistance reached those who needed it most rather than becoming merely another charitable gesture performed for social appearance rather than genuine purpose. Ruth, whose loyalty and friendship had never wavered throughout Alina's extraordinary transformation, eventually married a steward from a neighboring estate, and Alina insisted on hosting the wedding celebration at Ashcombe itself, determined that her closest friend should experience at least a portion of the joy and grandeur that had characterized her own wedding 2 years earlier. Agnes, now retired from active kitchen work, but still residing comfortably on the estate through Alina's careful arrangement, attended with evident pride, having long since abandoned her earlier warnings about servants who caught a master's eye, replaced instead by cheerful boasting to anyone who would listen about having known the future Duchess, since her earliest days scrubbing pots in the very kitchens Agnes herself had once ruled with practiced authority. Lady Prudence, meanwhile, found herself increasingly drawn into Alina's charitable endeavors, discovering unexpected satisfaction in work that extended beyond the marriage arrangements and social calculations that had previously consumed most of her attention. The two women, once positioned as adversaries during the difficult early days of Julian and Alina's courtship, developed a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared dedication to causes neither had anticipated finding meaningful before circumstances brought them together so unexpectedly. The mystery of Harold Winthrop, the distant cousin who had quietly purchased her father's old debts, resolved itself more gently than Alina had initially feared. He eventually made contact directly, somewhat sheepish about his original motivations, but genuinely relieved to release the debts entirely, once he understood Alina had found happiness and security through her marriage, rather than requiring rescue through any arrangement he might have proposed. The two developed a cautious but genuine family connection over subsequent years, and Harold's own son eventually became a frequent visitor to Ashcombe, forming a friendship with Julian and Alina's growing family that neither had anticipated when this strange chapter of their shared history first began unfolding. 3 years after their wedding, Alina gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Margaret in honor of the woman whose unexpected visit had provided the crucial thread that eventually unraveled Fenwick's lies and restored the Winthrop family name to its rightful dignity. Margaret Price herself, elderly but still sharp-witted and vigorous, wept with joy upon learning of the honor, declaring that she had never expected such recognition for simply remembering an old friend's kindness during a difficult season of both their lives. Julian proved a devoted father, determined that his children would grow up understanding the value of character over mere circumstance, a lesson he credited entirely to the woman who had taught him this truth through her own remarkable example. He often told young Margaret, as she grew older, the story of how her mother had once transformed an entire ballroom's cruel laughter into genuine wonder through nothing more than quiet dignity, and the courage to accept an invitation that everyone around her had expected she would refuse. Alina, for her part, never forgot the years of hardship that had shaped her before fortune restored her to a position she had once believed permanently lost. She maintained close relationships with the household staff throughout Ashcombe, ensuring that no servant within her household ever experienced the casual dismissal or careless cruelty that had characterized so much of her own earlier treatment before circumstances elevated her unexpectedly into nobility once more. She often walked through the kitchens herself, remembering the long hours she had once spent there, and the staff who worked alongside her found in their Duchess not distant authority but genuine understanding, a rare quality among those born to privilege that Alina possessed precisely because she had never truly forgotten what it meant to lack it. Years later, when their own daughter reached the age of her first proper ball, Alina took particular care in teaching her the same lessons her own mother had once imparted, that grace and dignity belonged to character rather than circumstance, that kindness toward those less fortunate reflected true nobility far more accurately than any inherited title ever could, and that courage, when called upon at the most unexpected and vulnerable moments, had the power to transform not only one's own fate, but the perceptions and hearts of everyone fortunate enough to witness it. The story of the ballroom that had once laughed at a kitchen girl's unlikely invitation to dance became, over the following decades, something of a beloved legend throughout the county, told and retold at countless gatherings, as an example of how quickly judgment could give way to genuine admiration when confronted with authentic courage and unexpected grace. Alina herself grew somewhat weary of hearing the tale repeated with ever more dramatic embellishments as the years passed, though she never denied its essential truth, understanding that the story had come to represent something larger than her own personal history, a reminder to every generation that followed that true worth could never be permanently buried beneath circumstance, no matter how completely fortune's cruelty might attempt to disguise it. News eventually reached Ashcombe that Cedric, living quietly on his distant inherited property, had married a widow of modest means some years after his failed schemes against Julian and Alina, apparently having found, in the absence of grand ambition, a simpler contentment he had never managed to achieve while chasing a title that was never truly his to claim. Julian read the news with quiet satisfaction, glad that his cousin had eventually found some measure of peace, even if the path there had required considerable humbling along the way. He sent a brief letter of goodwill upon hearing of the marriage, and though Cedric never replied, Julian liked to believe the gesture had been received in the spirit it was intended, a final closing of old wounds that no longer required active tending. Mr. Pemberton continued serving as the family's trusted solicitor for many years afterward, often remarking, in his dry and understated manner, that no case in his long career had ever proven quite so satisfying to resolve as the restoration of the Winthrop name, nor quite so dramatic in its unfolding. He attended Eleanor and Julian's family gatherings whenever his schedule permitted, treated by the household less as a hired professional and more as a trusted family friend, who had played an indispensable role in securing their happiness. Lady Beatrice, reconciled fully with her niece, became a frequent visitor to Ashcombe in her later years, delighting in the company of her great-niece and the grandchildren who followed, and often remarking to anyone who would listen that she had never imagined her difficult, quiet niece would grow into a woman capable of commanding such genuine respect and affection throughout the county. She passed away peacefully nearly a decade after the wedding, having spent her final years finally at peace with the family connection she had once so carelessly neglected during Eleanor's most vulnerable years. Eleanor never stopped visiting the kitchens at Ashcombe, even as her own daughter grew old enough to question why a duchess would concern herself with matters so far beneath her current station. Because, Eleanor would explain patiently, I have stood on both sides of that kitchen door, and I have learned that the view from either side reveals more about a person's character than any title or fortune ever could. Never forget, my darling, that kindness costs nothing to give, yet means everything to those who receive it, particularly from those with the power to withhold it instead. Her daughter grew up carrying that lesson forward into her own adult life, and the charitable fund Eleanor had established in her mother's memory continued operating for generations afterward, quietly assisting countless servants and household staff who found themselves, through misfortune rather than fault, suddenly without position or security, precisely as Eleanor herself had once feared before fortune and courage together rewrote the ending she had long believed inevitable. The old locket, eventually passed down to her own daughter upon Eleanor's death many years later, remained within the family for generations afterward, a small, tarnished reminder that the most remarkable transformations often begin not with grand gestures or fortunate birth, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let circumstance define a person's worth, and the quiet courage required to accept an invitation, however unlikely, that everyone else expected would end only in humiliation rather than joy. And so, decades after that fateful evening, when a duke's impulsive invitation had first threatened to become a source of public humiliation, the story instead endured as a testament to resilience, honesty, and the quiet, unshakable strength that had carried a grieving young woman through the darkest years of her life until fortune, finally, restored to her everything she had once believed permanently lost, and gave her, in addition, a love and partnership she had never dared to imagine finding at all.